14 million. I sold it a long time ago. The words landed like a slap, slicing through the clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversation. Theron stood at the center of the table, his wine glass raised high, wearing the easy grin of a man convinced he had done something brilliant. Corbin felt the room tilt. The it he spoke of wasn't just land, it was his vineyard, his home. The legacy Linnea and he had built row by row over 35 years. Astoria, seated beside him, leaned back in her chair, one hand draped over his arm. A slow, knowing smirk curled her lips as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Corbin forced his fork to the plate, the silver tines meeting with a muted clink. "You sold it?" He kept his tone steady, though his fingers tightened in his lap. Theron's smile didn't falter. It was the right move. Father, time to let go of old burdens. Old burdens? That's what he called the vines Corbin had nursed through drought and flood. The soil he'd walked barefoot in every spring. The home where he'd raised Theron and his brother. A ripple of discomfort moved around the table. Some glanced at Corbin, others at their plates, unsure which direction to look. He studied his son's face, searching for a glimmer of humor, a trace that this was some ill-timed joke, but there was only the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. Corbin lifted his own glass out of reflex, but the wine barely touched his lips. His thoughts were already pulling away from the table, from the polite smiles, from the pretense of family. If Theron's words were true, then somewhere, somehow, Corbin's name had been signed away without his hand ever touching the pen. The next morning, Corbin was halfway through his first cup of coffee when the phone rang. The caller ID flashed a name he hadn't seen in months. Beckett Thorne, an old friend and the branch manager at the bank he'd trusted since before Theron was born. "Corbin," he began, his tone careful, "I just need to confirm something. Did you approve the transfer of the vineyard sale proceeds to an account overseas?" The coffee turned bitter in Corbin's mouth. "No, Beckett. I never approved any transfer because I never sold the vineyard." He hesitated. "That's what I thought. But the file says otherwise. It includes a medical assessment stating you're legally incapacitated and a power of attorney naming Theron as your sole representative. Both have your signature." Corbin gripped the edge of the counter. "Email them to me right now." The documents arrived within minutes. He opened them slowly, bracing himself. The so-called medical report claimed he had advanced cognitive decline, issued by a clinic in Scottsdale he'd never visited. The power of attorney was neatly typed, his name beneath a signature that looked almost but not quite like his. The loops, the tilt, the pressure, all wrong. "Ahamisit vani eleg simavolt, hogi barkit meg saljon, akinemismerte akezet." He could hear Beckett's voice again. "If this escrow closes, there's no undoing it without a long, ugly fight." Corbin thanked him, though the words caught in his throat. His mind was already replaying Theron's smug toast, the way Astoria's eyes had flicked to him like she was savoring a private victory. Closing the laptop, Corbin let his hands rest flat against its lid, steadying his breath. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a full-scale theft of his life, wrapped in legal paper and signed in his stolen name. And if they thought he would go quietly, they didn't know him at all. By the end of that week, every attempt to reach Orion ended the same way. One ring, then the call cut off. His email bounced back with an auto-reply claiming his account was no longer in use. Theron had ensured his brother was busy with a long-term conservation project in Patagonia, complete with limited internet access and a cover story about Corbin wanting peace and quiet. When Corbin asked Theron if he'd spoken to his brother, he smiled faintly and said, "He's busy. You should focus on resting, Father." The words sounded benign, but the look behind them was a locked door. Astoria became the gatekeeper of Corbin's days. She started scheduling his errands, claiming she didn't want him to be tired. Visitors were told he wasn't feeling well. Even Isolde, the gardener who'd worked with them for over 12 years, was turned away at the gate without warning. Corbin walked through his own home as though it belonged to someone else. The rooms were the same, but the air was different, heavy, monitored. Conversations in the hallway hushed when he appeared, doors closed a beat too quickly. The vineyard, once his sanctuary, now felt like an exhibit he could only view from a distance. One afternoon, he tried to drive into Asheville for groceries. The car keys were missing from their hook. When he asked, Astoria laughed lightly and said, "Oh, I put them somewhere safe. You don't need to worry about driving." That night, Corbin sat in the dim light of the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. He could hear them talking in the den. Theron's low voice, Astoria's higher one, the occasional laugh. He couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. Every sound told him they were confident, certain they'd built a cage he wouldn't see until it was too late. Corbin took a slow breath and let it settle in his chest. If they thought this isolation would weaken him, they'd underestimated the man who had weathered 35 years of harvests, storms and droughts. Some roots grow stronger in the dark. It was late afternoon when the driveway fell silent. Theron and Astoria had left not 15 minutes earlier, their voices still echoing faintly in Corbin's mind from the sharp exchange they'd had over lunch. He knew they wouldn't be back for at least an hour. They had a meeting in town, as Astoria called it, with that air of self-importance she wore like perfume. They were so consumed with the final details of their grand plan that their vigilance had begun to wane. That was when he heard the doorbell. Unannounced visitors had become almost impossible these days. But when he peered through the curtain, he saw Arden Hayes standing on the porch, her expression sharp and unreadable, a thick leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Corbin pulled the door open quickly, glancing toward the driveway to be sure no car was turning back. "Come in quickly," he said. "You've been set up," she said plainly. She slid the first page toward him, the forged medical evaluation he'd already seen. Now, alongside a notarized power of attorney in Theron's name. Beneath it, a preliminary sale agreement for the vineyard dated weeks before that family luncheon. Corbin traced a finger over the paper, feeling the weight of each lie. "How did you get these?" "A colleague at the county recorder's office flagged them," she replied. "I've already filed a temporary hold on the sale. It's not permanent, but it buys us a little time." Her eyes held his. "Once the escrow closes, undoing this will take years and cost you more than you want to imagine. We need evidence. Enough to prove deliberate fraud." The word fraud hung in the air between them, heavy and clarifying. Corbin nodded slowly. "Then we get it." She leaned back, assessing him. "They think you're isolated, cornered. Let them keep thinking that. It'll make them careless." The plan began to form right there between the two of them and a cooling pot of tea. Corbin would play the role they'd scripted for him. The distracted, weary man, too trusting to see the knife in his back. And while they believed their performance was flawless, he'd be building his. By the time Arden left, the first outlines of a trap were already taking shape in his mind. 2 mornings later, Corbin invited Theron and Astoria for tea in the garden. The vines stretched in neat rows around them, leaves whispering in the late summer breeze. He wore his softest cardigan, the one that always made him look smaller somehow, and moved slowly as though fatigue had settled into his bones. He let the conversation drift before leaning forward with a faint smile. "I've been thinking about what you said about selling. Maybe you could explain it again, so I understand all the benefits." Theron's eyes lit with triumph, the way a man looks when he believes the battle is already won. He was so confident in his manipulation that he didn't even consider the possibility of a trap. "Of course, father, the buyers are based in Geneva. International money, no taxes here, no headaches. You'd have a comfortable allowance and the rest, well, we'd invest it." Geneva. The word caught like a burr in Corbin's mind. He hadn't seen it in any of the forged paperwork Beckett sent him. That detail was new and valuable. Astoria sipped her tea, her tone light. "It's a chance to move on, Corbin. You can finally rest." Corbin nodded faintly, letting his gaze drop as if in thought. Inside the pocket of his cardigan, a small digital recorder hummed to life, catching every word. They spoke freely for nearly 25 minutes, outlining their plans as though Corbin were already a footnote. A penthouse in Miami, a portfolio in Theron's name, liquidating the old place before the market turns. They were so consumed by their vision of wealth that they completely overlooked Corbin's sudden compliance as anything but a sign of his complete surrender. When the teapot was empty, Corbin thanked them softly and watched them walk back toward the house, their voices carrying with the breeze. That evening, he slipped into Linnea's old study, lifted the loose floorboard beneath the desk, and slid the recorder into the hidden space they'd once used for spare keys and emergency cash. It wasn't much yet, but it was the first real thread he could pull. The next day, Arden filed a petition to freeze the escrow account, citing suspected fraud. It wasn't a guaranteed win, but it was enough to stall the process and keep the money from disappearing overnight. In the meantime, she had been digging. Late one evening, she called with the kind of news that sharpens your focus instantly. The medical evaluation naming you incompetent? It came from a clinic in Scottsdale, except that clinic shut down 3 years ago. The physician who supposedly signed it died last winter. Corbin gripped the phone tighter. So they fabricated the whole thing. Fabricated and laundered it through someone they knew, she said. The signature on the report belongs to a man who happens to be Astoria's cousin. The walls of his home seemed to press in a little closer. Every hallway, every quiet room felt like it had ears. Corbin knew he couldn't let them see even a crack in his composure, so he made himself smaller. He forgot little things on purpose, the name of a wine, the day of the week, just enough to feed the story they'd built. Theron began to talk more freely, slipping in details about the buyer's timeline and keeping Orion in the dark until after closing. Each word was a bead on a string Corbin was threading together, one that would eventually form a noose around their plan. Arden and Corbin managed to meet twice that week, both times here at the vineyard when Theron and Astoria were away on errands. They kept to the old study at the back of the house, the one they rarely entered, its door closed and curtains drawn, away from their eyes and ears. They compared notes, her legal strategy and his growing collection of recordings. She told him the DA's office already had a financial crimes investigator reviewing every forged document and transaction. The net was tightening, but so was the deadline. Each meeting ended the same way, Arden slipping out quietly, leaving Corbin with the sound of the gravel drive settling back into silence. By Friday afternoon, after their second meeting, Corbin knew the next step had to come from him. Something bold enough to make them believe he was ready to hand it all over. On Sunday morning, Corbin found Theron in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone while Astoria measured coffee into the press. He stepped in quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, and let a small, practiced sigh escape. "I've been thinking," he began, letting his voice waver just enough. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to sell." Theron looked up sharply, a smile spreading before he could hide it. His smugness blinded him to any deceit. "That's a wise decision, Father. You won't regret it." Astoria's eyes glittered. "We can set up a meeting with the buyer's representative this week. You'll only need to sign a few things, nothing complicated. Corbin nodded as if relieved. Good. I want to make sure you two aren't burdened anymore. You've done so much already. The flattery landed exactly where he wanted it. Theron leaned back, his shoulders relaxing. He started talking about a closing lunch, a celebration before the documents were finalized. Corbin listened, nodding at the right places while committing every word to memory. That evening, he called Arden. They think I'm ready. There will be a meeting and a lunch. Perfect, she said. We'll have the recorder ready. Just keep them talking. Don't push. Let them brag. Corbin could hear the quiet confidence in her voice, the assurance of someone who had cornered bigger predators before. They agreed on the plan, step by careful step. By the time he hung up, the stage was set. All that remained was to play his part so well that they never saw the trap closing until it was too late. The restaurant they chose was all polished wood and white linen, the kind of place Theron always picked when he wanted to impress someone. They were shown to a corner table away from the main crowd, where the sunlight spilled in through tall windows. Corbin wore his soft gray suit, the one that looked a little worn at the cuffs, and let his shoulders slump just enough to suggest fatigue. They ordered champagne before they'd even opened the menus. To new beginnings, Theron said, raising his glass. Astoria's smile was all teeth. Corbin returned the toast, letting the bubbles brush his lips but not drinking much. Tell me again, he said lightly, how this will all work. I want to be able to explain it properly when people ask. That was all the prompting they needed. Theron launched into the timeline, the buyer's representative arriving from Geneva. The transfer scheduled within 72 hours. The escrow release once the final signatures were collected. Astoria added her own flourishes, speaking of the Miami penthouse they'd already put a deposit on, the trips they'd take once the vineyard was liquidated. Her voice held the unguarded thrill of someone convinced the prize was already theirs. The recorder hidden in the lining of Corbin's briefcase caught every word. He nodded, asked small questions, even laughed once when Theron joked about how Orion would find out in the papers. By the time dessert arrived, they were relaxed, leaning back in their chairs, the deal all but signed in their minds. Corbin excused himself to the restroom, where he texted Arden a single word. Done. When he returned, they lingered a few more minutes over coffee before parting ways in the parking lot. Theron kissed Corbin's cheek, his confidence radiating like heat off the asphalt. Corbin drove home slowly, the recorder secure, his mind already shifting to the next morning when their celebration would turn to ash. At dawn, the air over the vineyard was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of ripening grapes. Corbin was in the kitchen tying the last piece of twine around the small gift box, honey, lavender, and the note, when the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached his ears. He stepped into the hallway just as Theron emerged from the den in his robe, Astoria following in her silk dressing gown. "What's going on?" Theron asked, brow furrowed. "I wanted to give you something before things change," Corbin said, holding out the box. Astoria's eyes narrowed in suspicion, but she took it from his hands. She opened the lid, glanced at the honey, the lavender, then read the note inside. Her expression faltered. The moment hung between them for only a heartbeat before a firm knock rattled the front door. Corbin opened it to find two detectives on the porch, badges in full view. "Theron Bramwell?" "Astoria Bramwell?" the lead detective said evenly. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Theron spun toward Corbin, his voice sharp. "What is this?" Before Corbin could answer, Arden stepped forward from behind the detectives, the folded warrant in her hand. "It's the end of your scheme," she said calmly. Astoria's smirk collapsed entirely, her knuckles whitening as she clutched the box. The detectives entered, reading the charges aloud. Fraud, forgery, elder financial abuse. Each word landed heavy in the stillness of the house. The click of the handcuffs was final. Theron tried to speak, but the officers guided him firmly toward the door. Astoria followed, her silk robe brushing the floor, the gift box still pressed against her side like a useless shield. As they stepped outside into the waiting morning light, Corbin turned to Arden and said, "Let's start putting my home back in order." The vineyard felt different that afternoon, not because the vines had changed, but because the weight pressing on them, on Corbin, was finally gone. Arden stayed long enough to go over the formalities. Restitution agreements, the court schedule, and the assurance that the temporary hold had been replaced by a permanent block against any unauthorized sale. When she left, Corbin walked the rows alone, letting his hand trail over the leaves. The soil was warm beneath his shoes, the same earth Linnea and he had turned together decades ago. It had survived droughts, floods, pests, and now it had survived betrayal. News of the arrest spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors stopped by with quiet words, some with casseroles, others with nothing but a clasp of his hand. Corbin accepted it all with gratitude, but without the need to explain more than he wished. That evening, Orion arrived. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew enough from the news and from a cautious call Arden had placed to him once the arrests were certain. His face was etched with a mixture of relief and unspoken regret for his absence. They stood on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills, the sky stained gold and rose. "You kept it," Orion said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I did," Corbin replied, feeling the truth of it in his bones. He put a hand on Orion's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the storm they had weathered. Later, he walked to the guest house at the edge of the property, a place that had once been for visiting friends but had sat unused for years. He unlocked the door, breathing in the faint scent of cedar, and imagined the men and women who might find safety here. People whose families had tried to strip them of everything just as his had. The idea had been forming quietly for weeks, even before the arrests. Now it had a shape, a purpose. This land wouldn't just be his refuge, it would be theirs too. He closed the door and stood for a moment in the twilight, the hum of crickets rising from the vineyard. The storm had passed, but the roots remained deep, unshaken, and wholly his. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.